With this chapter on early Christian art, we're going to return to the event, the phenomenon of the Cairo with Constantine. Where are we in time? The Roman Empire is divided into two, and Constantine wants to reunite them under his sole authority. As the legend goes, in attempting to complete this endeavor of unification, just before a key battle, the Milvian Bridge battle, this recreates a dream that Constantine had the night before, in which Christ told him he should use the sign of the cross, the Cairo, against his enemies. He sees a cross of light in the sky just before the battle, with the words in Greek that are generally translated into Latin as, "In this sign I shall conquer." A little note about define primitive in what era by whom as a segue side line there. So this essential battle in which Constantine's idea of sole authority is proclaimed and is sanctified in a sense by his dream, by the Cairo, turned out to be the beginning of a new era of religious tolerance, one that occurs under Constantine, in which he is victorious, and this becomes part of something known as the 313 edicts or laws, let's call them, of Milan. The most important aspect of which, as we study it, is that you can worship whatever God you want. A proclamation that permanently establishes religious tolerance for Christianity, not just pagan faith, any other faith within the Roman Empire. And this, again, is an outcome of a political agreement, a decree, a law, signed in Milan between two Roman emperors at the time, Constantine and Licinius. This specifies that Christians can't be arrested, tortured, killed for their faith. There are a number of religious, let's call them cults or movements, emerging and existing at this time in the Roman Empire. So cult in this sense doesn't mean kind of, I would characterize it as kind of wacko Jonestown cults in which followers of that leader and newly established religious tradition all committed suicide. Cult in this context, at this point in the Roman Empire, just refers to religion. There's the state religion, right? And then there's Christianity and Judaism. Previous to this period in time, the Roman Empire would tolerate other religions, but it did insist that if you were within its boundaries, you had to at least pay lip service to its own mandated state religion. Pagan religions, Roman pagan ones, include what? They honor various gods, not just one. Christians and Jews are not following this tradition because they're monotheistic. They worship one God. And this violated the Roman religious precepts. Although, again, they sort of, as long as you didn't make a big deal out of your monotheistic faith, they tolerated it. Officially, the empire was allowed to torture Christians if they so wanted to, and especially because Christians wouldn't acknowledge state religion. As mentioned before, this idea of a religion and emperors who rule over far away nations and continents, again, the Middle East, Africa, are memorialized on coins, coin heads. You can see Augustus Prima Porta. And these are vehicles, in a sense, for transporting the rule of and the concept and the ideology of the colonialism of the Roman Empire to far-flung places on the earth. Again, the leaders of the Roman Empire, various leaders such as Augustine Prima Porta and Constantine, are consecrated on these objects of currency, of coinage. And it's quite a massive empire as it exists at this time of a major religious conversion and, again, new era of tolerance. What is art depicting at this time, and where, in what manner, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, do we find it, and where? The catacombs are a major source of art created at this time, as are the menorah. There are believed to be 7 of them. We'll look at a little bit later on after the catacombs. And in this particular catacomb in San Pietro and Martellino, we see the Good Shepherd, Oryns, and the story of Jonah. What is that storyline? Most notably, a biblical one. When we see Jesus, as we just did, represented as the Good Shepherd, in a sense, he looks like the generic shepherd without much of a reference to being the Son of God. And this recalls for us, though, the narrative of the Good Shepherd story, which, as an ideology, goes along the lines of, I am the Good Shepherd, and a good shepherd lays down his life for his people. We also see this story of Jonah and the whale. So this is a piece that is telling a biblical story from the Hebrew Bible that depicts Jonah being swallowed by the whale, notably after 3 days, just as per the story of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Jonah is spat out by the whale, as though he is resurrected. So Christians are building these scriptures, creating these frescoes or in the catacombs that are talking about the Old Testament stories. And in this part, we see Jesus, he's flying. This is the part that we call the Oryns, which he has these little hands sort of flying through the air, praying. Judaism is fundamental to Christianity at this time. Christianity is built on it. And what are the precepts, the rules of this, the guidelines of this religion? One God, again, monotheistic, who makes a covenant, an agreement with his followers. And Jewish scriptures that become the Old Testament outline this promise to the Israelites. This also takes the notion of a Messiah, a coming Messiah, the Messiah who will come, and applies it to Jesus of Nazareth. Instead of the ongoing waiting of the Jews for their Messiah, all of a sudden there's a timeline, in a sense, not a shelf life, although if we look at Jesus' life, that is certainly one interpretation. But all of a sudden there's a timeline attached to this idea of a Savior, of a Messiah. As we see this depicted, Jesus as the Good Shepherd, leading his flock. When we look here at this image of Christ as the Good Shepherd, sitting on rocks with his gold halo And his purple attire, carefully consider what's in his hands. Not a crook like a shepherd's staff, but a cross. This is what happens when Christ is fulfilling his earthly role. And with this transition to a tolerance for Christians, because they were no longer lawfully able to be abused after the Edict of Milan, we see this, let's call it, larger Mosaic program occurring as Christ keeps getting more refined in terms of his development. He's being depicted in a more overt and confident way because it is now legal to talk about him through such visual representations. Therefore, he's gaining public authority and power, even though here, of course, he is depicted as a mere mortal and also a shepherd. We find this mosaic in the oratory of the Galla Placidia or Placidia Church in Ravenna, in Italy, of course. Other important early Christian architecture includes that of the Santa Sabina exterior in Rome, as well as its interior. A very typical, what becomes a template-like architectural plan diagrammed here for a basilica, a Christian house of worship at this time. This very typical architectural construction consists of a number of rectangular elements. One end is rounded, as we can see here, which is where the local ruler would be sitting, from which he would hold forth. Christ is now depicted in the interior of these buildings in this idea of post-Reformation, when Christians begin building churches. And again, basilicas are the most common type of structure, and where the regional ruler stands at that altar, we can see at the far end of the church here. There's also at this time the issue of the iconoclastic controversy, which is a dispute over the use of religious images, or icons, as they were called, in the Byzantine Empire. Iconoclasts completely rejected images that were used to venerate, for religious veneration. And one of those reasons being that it was a reference to the Old Testament prohibition against images in the Ten Commandments. This was seen as idolatrous, as the worship of images. We find a commonality here between the Old Testament, the Jewish faith, and the Islamic one, which also prohibits worship of icons and labels as idolatry. The Christians, on the other hand, are very invested in iconography, images of Jesus on the cross, of the bloody Jesus being taken off the cross, of Mary, of the apostles, as fundamental aspects of the language with which they speak to their constituency visually, and reaffirm their faith through that. Interiors of the Santa Sabina, and the Basilica plan. Here, with the Church of Santa Costanza, which is not on our lecture guide, but we're reviewing it anyway, we see a church that is horse-shaped, also round, and different than the configuration we would see, for instance, with the Santa Sabina, where we have this idea of the altar as a necessary gathering place that is part of the ritual of proclaiming one's faith, gathering once a week, that's served so successfully as part of the new ritual of Christianity. We see a church that is, in fact, a mausoleum of Costanza, who was also known as Constantina, the daughter of Constantine, that he built for her after she died. Costanza is also Costanza, hence the Church of Saint Costanza. And a diagram of its layout here, its interior. We have also depicted here the ritual of the somewhat bacchanalian, so there's a pagan ritual combined here, of the grape gathering, the harvest. And in this idea of the harvesting of the grapes, of course, we hearken back to one of the original precepts of the Catholic Church, which is, of course, the concentration of the authority of Jesus, as complicated in a sense as that idea of him is. In that, if we think back to the two earlier times when gods, in Egyptian times, the pharaoh, we have a god, we have a king, and we have a divine ruler. Although, of course, the Egyptians were not monotheistic, they worshipped various gods, as did the Romans. They were polytheistic. But Jesus is a complicated image too. We call him the Son of God, but he's also a human being. So he represents this dual nature. And we will, of course, have the body and blood of Christ become part of the ritual of Christianity. And, of course, that relates to consecrating wine, and that is consumed as part of this ritual. With the grape harvest, we also say the idea of the passage of time. And this is something that can pertain to both pagans and Christians. Wine doesn't necessarily have to be representational solely of religious Christian iconography and its sacramental use. There's also the Roman aspect of harvesting the grapes.